Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Exmoor and Dartmoor National Park authorities on the Net Zero Challenge for our national parks. As we are all becoming increasingly aware of the climate and wider environmental emergencies, it's obvious that rapid reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable land management are becoming increasingly central to local, national and international policy agendas. And of course, the response to these challenges can only be done in partnership. As national park authorities, we don't have the tools to tackle the issues, but together with the partners, many of whom are in this webinar today, we've got a stronger chance to take the action needed to deliver rapid and significant cuts in greenhouse gases, needed to stay within the internationally agreed targets to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. For Exmoor, this is particularly timely. We're currently reviewing our National Park Partnership Plan, and today's presentation and discussions will help inform the targets and action on climate change in that plan. Before we start, you've already seen this is being recorded, but a few just quick points of housekeeping. Cameras and microphones off unless you're presenting. And the second thing, we're all familiar with using the chat function, but if you could use the Q&A function that you can see on your screen, not the chat function, we can't monitor both, but we're going to have a good go at monitoring the Q&A function and pulling the questions together. You can also comment in the Q&A function. My colleagues Claire and Alex, who've been putting this together along with Dan James, are all in this room with me, so hopefully we're going to make things run smoothly. They're going to operate the Q&A questions and introduce the speakers and the panel. So it's being recorded. We'll make everything available afterwards. We'll put it on both our websites and send you links. And the carbon footprint reports that some of you have seen already are also on the websites. So we're ready, off we go. First two speakers who are talking about the Exmoor and Dartmoor National Park carbon footprint assessments recently completed. We have Professor Mike Berners-Lee and Dr. Dmitry Yumashev, both from Small World Consulting, and they're going to give us an overview on those carbon assessments. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And I'll just start off by seeing if I can share the screen. Okay, great. Okay, so just I'm just going to talk for a few moments just by way of overview, and then hand over to Dmitry, who's done him and his team have done most of the heavy lifting on this work. But just to say, so Small World Consulting, for those who don't know about it, we're a small consultancy based up at Lancaster University. We work with organizations of just about every different size and sector that you can think of. And the way I describe it is that what the commonality is that we help organizations to make an appropriate response to the climate and ecological emergency that we're facing. And a lot of that work is around carbon footprinting, but it's also increasingly around a kind of much more holistic approach to the challenges that we face. Just this work that we're about to present now, it's part of what's been quite a major project for us, and a very complex project for us. And it builds on at least 10 years worth of work with the Lake District National Park, doing a similar kind of reporting of emissions and tracking progress and so on. And a couple of years ago, I guess, possibly even more than that now, we embarked on this project of, on the one hand, enhancing the way that we do the work, and on the other hand, bringing out a compatible approach to all of the national parks in the UK. And the work that we're doing, is very hard to be accurate about it. Anyone who says that any carbon footprint assessments that involve taking what we call a consumption approach. So in other words, looking not just at the emissions that are directly released within the park, but also the emissions that are within the supply chains of, for example, the consumption by residents and visitors within the park. It's very hard to be accurate about that kind of stuff. And in fact, any of the elements of this, it's very hard to be as accurate as it's tempting to claim that things are. But nevertheless, it is possible to adopt a kind of robust and good enough approach to the information that allows a kind of setting of baselines and targets in a way that we hope captures all the things that matter and bring all the things that matter from a climate perspective into the target setting process. So what we include, broadly speaking, it's, as I say, a consumption-based approach. So in other words, we include things like all the carbon in the lifestyles of residents within the park, including everything they buy and do, and the same for visitors when they're in the park, and the same for also visitors when they're traveling to the parks, which we specifically include because it's so important. And we also include all the kind of all the land use elements as well. And as you'll see, industry emissions also get a look in. And we've included for the target setting, it's a slightly different boundary from the one that we set for the the boundary of the baseline. And the reason for that, I'll just in the subsequent slides, I'll just explain. Okay, so the criteria for choosing the emissions targets is slightly different from the baseline, and the reason for that is the criteria for what to include and what not to include was slightly different. So we wanted to include everything we thought was significant and over which the park and their partners could have significant influence. We needed to keep it somehow simple enough that it would be possible to get your head around it, because you could immerse yourself in never-ending complexity over the ultimate target if you put your mind to it. But you'd probably end up with something that wasn't usable. And we wanted something where we could actually track the progress. So part of the criteria was about where are there metrics that we can actually use to show progress year on year. So it's a kind of the target boundary is sort of a hybrid of all those things, and it's not a perfect process getting that exactly right. But what I would say is it's the approach we've adopted for all the parks is the same throughout. So it's a very kind of uniform and consistent process that we've adopted. And so, yeah, a few notes on these targets, and they're this blend of consumption-based and territorial. The targets reflect the unique characteristics of each park. But what we've tried to do is, as you'll see and Dmitry will take you through the details in a second, there are 6 elements to each target. And we've tried to take each of those 6 components on a trajectory which is as close as we could sort of say was in line with what the science is saying needs to be happening in that particular aspect of the target. And because all the parks are have different characteristics, what that results in is that the net zero date for each park turns out to be different. So, for example, if you've got lots of people and lots of industry and lots of visitors, but not that much land, then it becomes much harder to get to net zero than if you've got lots of land and hardly any people. But they are all designed to be the same level of ambition. And broadly speaking, compatible with 1.5 and the Paris Agreement. Okay, and then just to stand back to the major opportunity for these parks, And for us, it's exciting. We're always trying to, in all our work at Small World, we're trying to work with potential exemplars in every industry, in every kind of business, in every kind of organization. And the parks really are that. If you could show in any one of the UK's national parks, or ideally in all of them, what it would look like to be properly on a journey to transition, then that, in many ways, that sets up a role model for how the world can make transitions. And even the process of putting all this together, an exemplary process, is something which can be copied elsewhere. And I think, on the one hand, there's a ton of complexity around the number crunching and so on, and we've put a lot of effort into all of that, and the setting of targets and so on. And then making it work is obviously about bringing together lots of different agendas, including everything about land stewardship beyond just carbon. But it's also about creating environments in which the parks can be better places to live and to visit and to work. And we think that potentially there is incredible scope for setting up exemplary places that demonstrate that the journey to sustainability is actually also a journey of increasing well-being. It's about making places more exciting to live and visit in. And it can also be good for the economy as well. But how do you bring about that scenario? Well, I think it's a mixture of two things. One is it takes some real creativity to work out, what would it take, for example, for the journey to transition to become so exciting from a visitor perspective that suddenly it became a place that everybody wanted to come and visit, and that created employment in the visitor economy, and also at the same time became a place that was just felt like a joy to live in and a joy to work in. How can all that be brought together, and how can all the different stakeholders involved in making that work be brought together? And that's the second point, is the coordination, the kind of integration of all the many different actors and all the different stakeholders and partners in the park partnerships. So I think that's why this is incredibly challenging, but if any park can get it right, incredibly rewarding, I think. And one of the things I'll just mention very quickly that we've been doing, so that some of the parks have been piloting, is a project with an organization called One Planet that has specifically been developing tools to enable different partners and different organizations to integrate and join up all the work that they're doing and all their strategies, plans, and actions, so that to enable a kind of just more systemic approach to dealing with all this stuff. And in a way, I'm really excited by that. I hope it works, because it picks up where we leave off at Small World. We present this picture of where's the carbon and where are the targets and all sorts of recommendations, but out of that we're conscious that we leave you guys with the challenge of, all right, well, how on earth do we implement all this? So we hope that those tools are helpful in that process. Okay, at this point, I hand over to Dmitry, who's done, as I say, has done a tremendous job over the last couple of years with the heavy lifting on this.
Great, thanks so much. Well, my job is to talk you through some of the results and the numbers. I'll try to do it as gently as possible. There is a lot of data that's coming out of this assessment, and I'm just going to talk you through some of the highlights, just to see how the parks compare, Exmoor and Dartmoor, and what those pathways and targets look like for these two national parks. Just a quick recap of what Mike has already said. We've got a lot of different actors and sources of emissions in the landscapes: residents, visitors traveling within the area or to and from the area, businesses, industries within, as well as land use and management. And all those things, they overlap in one way or the other. So it's incredibly challenging to get the figures that represent accurately all those components, but at the same time don't have many overlaps and double counting. And I think that's what we've been doing when we try to propose the baselines and the targets for each of the national park. So a quick dashboard of the key stats for your areas. You would know your turf, so to speak, better than we do, but I think this is sort of the highlights of the scales of the land area, the scales of the resident population, the scale of the number of visitors and their behaviors, and of course the businesses and land. And so we've got the Dartmoor is bigger by about 50% in terms of the area, but about 4 times more people live there. Now, going back to looking at the visitors numbers, Dartmoor bigger about by 50% again. So if you look at those lines saying population density for residents on the left and for visitors on the right, much higher residential population for the Dartmoor, and just about the same visitor population in Exmoor and Dartmoor. And so we've got those numbers to look at to see how they will project into the carbon results. And other stats. So on the left-hand side column, look at the business turnovers. Again, Dartmoor is about 4 times bigger than Exmoor by the turnovers in their boundaries. Major through traffic across the roads as well. About 50% of traffic isn't even stopping in your areas. And on the right-hand side, again, back to the visitors, we've got sort of differences and similarities as well in the patterns. Exmoor is further away from major population centers, so it takes longer to get there, higher mileage. Most of the journeys are by car in both parks, and more international visitors in Exmoor. Again, more overnight stays, again, because it's more remote. So with all those things together, let's have a look at the first set of results for our emissions. Exmoor, that's the consumption-based footprint of the national park. Residents on the left-hand side, visitors in the national park in the middle, and then traveling to and from visitors on the right-hand side. Just get a feeling as to what the main components of the emissions are. Food and drink, vehicle fuel, flying, and things like that. These things include all the public services as well consumed in the boundary of the landscape. So Exmoor, that's the pattern for its footprints. Dartmoor, the scale here is 4 times larger than Exmoor. Much higher footprints of the residents because of the high residential population, and in proportion, much smaller visitors bars in the middle and on the right-hand side. And again, this structure reflects the nature of the landscapes, its residents and visitors population. Now, if we look at how the 2 national parks compare with UK averages in terms of the residential population's footprints, both national parks have higher emissions pretty much across all the categories that we track and report here, starting with fuel use at the top, and driving, flying, food and drink, and so on. Exmoor is marginally higher than Dartmoor, and both are considerably higher than UK average per person. You can see those figures at the top. The reason for that is that the populations are more, on average, more affluent compared to UK means. So as Mike explains really well, we've got to look carefully at the way to set the targets for you to pursue and to drive your efforts to reduce emissions. There are 6 priority areas here that we've been working with for all the national parks. They start with the energy consumption by all the actors within the landscape, residents, visitors, and industry. Food and drink, you've seen those bars, the very high emissions in the UK in general because of the diets and the supply chains and production systems that we've got. All the other goods consumed by residents and visitors, that's part of the consumption-based footprints, embedded carbon in all the goods, including cars. A separate category is traveling to and from the landscape for the visitors. Again, hugely important given that you are visitor hotspots, much higher volumes of visitors compared to other parts of the country. And the last 2 categories correspond to land-based emissions. The first one, called non-CO2 emissions, mostly it's livestock and fertilizer use footprints in the area. And the second one is the part focusing on CO2, and that's to do with carbon sequestration as well as emissions from soils and degrading peats. So those 6 components are allowing us to look at the baseline for each landscape and set the targets to reduce the emissions. That's what your respective baselines look like. Exmoor on the left, Dartmoor on the right-hand side. Because of the difference in the scale, the Dartmoor baseline is just under twice compared to the Exmoor baseline. But what is interesting here as well is not just the absolute scale, but the difference in the pattern, in how different categories of emissions compare to one another. For example, land-based emissions, sort of dark green column, land use non-CO2 is not far off between the landscapes, whereas the energy use, the black column, is much higher in the Dartmoor, just because of the residential population that is much bigger than Exmoor. And Dartmoor is a net sequester at the moment. That's the negative sort of flux on the very right-hand side, light green color, and the Exmoor is a net emitter from land at the moment, largely because of degrading peat. So that's the baseline where we are at. And what we're going to do next is to set targets to reduce the emissions and drive up carbon sequestration in each of the landscapes. What we are guided by here is a sort of a series of recent assessments in line with the latest science of staying within the 1.5 degree targets from the Paris Agreement. The 6 carbon budgets, Tyndall Carbon Budget Tool, National Food Strategy are the main sources of data and sort of clues to set us on the trajectory towards reducing emissions as fast as we can. So what you'll see now in the next couple of slides to conclude our introduction is assuming that we take an ambitious and immediate action across all these relevant areas that we just identified. So let's have a look what we have in terms of the targets. Now, it might be hard to interpret these pie charts to start with. We've got Exmoor on the left-hand side and Dartmoor on the right-hand side. What we're showing here is how your annual emissions have got to change between the base year, which is 2019 in these assessments, and mid-century across the key 6 key priority areas that we just identified. And the land-based components, so the light green color, is broken down in various key land-based measures. You can see new woodlands or restored peatland, for example, as well as a few what we call regenerative agriculture options. And you can see, first of all, the scale is roughly 60 or so % bigger in the Dartmoor because of the way the baseline is larger to start with, as well as the differences in potential to sequester carbon in land or reduce land-based emissions as they are currently. And then you can see the difference in the sort of relative shares in those sectors. So much more energy reduction is required in Dartmoor. Again, this is your residents, gas boilers, driving, everything to do with using fossil fuels for our lifestyles. Whereas for the Exmoor, those sectors are smaller, but we can see a very large sector for restoring peatland. And that reflects again on the fact that you've got a lot more peat relative to the overall size of the landscape compared to Dartmoor. So the key takeaways from here: Dartmoor, a lot more energy emissions need to be reduced. Food and drink obviously is there, and traveling to and from, and other goods. It's all important. Agriculture, again, they're roughly similar with the 2 national parks. But the key focus here is also on for Dartmoor is to extend the woodland cover and sequester carbon through woodland creation. For Exmoor, smaller energy share, a lot more to do with restoring peatlands, cutting current emissions from degrading peats, as well as, of course, doing what you can, again, in sequestering carbon through new woodlands. And managing agricultural lands, last but not least, is highly important as well. But in sort of relative terms, you can see things like cover cropping, better grassland management through legume species, hedging, agroforestry. They can only have a relatively smaller impact, even though they have to be rolled out across very large agricultural areas. So in terms of carbon alone, you can see where the biggest sort of gains are projected to be. So I'm going to conclude our introduction here with the pathways towards net zero and net negative emissions for the two national parks. So what you've just seen in the pie charts corresponds to the difference between the initial state in 2019 and where we want to be by the middle of the century. Now, this is the entire trajectory across those areas, and you can see that the starting point is quite different, and the relative sizes of the different bars are kind of quite a difference to start with. But then equally, with the targets that we proposed in these reports, you can achieve very large reductions in emissions at the top halves of the graphs, and scale up your negative emissions, carbon sequestration, as well as cut emissions from peat at the bottom part of the graph. And what it leads to is net negative national park for both Exmoor and Dartmoor around about 2040s. So you can play a major part in delivering the overall net zero for southwest England and for sort of major cities in your area, because they will have limited capacity to sequester carbon, residual emissions. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you guys, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Many thanks, Dmitry, and good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire Reid from Exmoor National Park Authority, and I'm going to be helping moderate the discussion and the remaining speakers, along with Alex Gandy.
Thank you, Claire. I'm Alex Gandy, Acting Head of Forward Planning Economy here at Dartmoor and Climate Lead. So yeah, thank you all for attending this shared webinar. Hopefully it'll be interesting. Claire's just going to see what questions are floating around for Mike and Dmitry.
Thank you. So before we go to the questions and answers, can you, we're going to run a short poll. So we're going to launch the poll, and whilst people are doing that, can you also be thinking about your questions that you would like to ask? We were planning to use the question and answer function to identify the questions. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll be able to take those questions and put them to Dmitry and Mike. I can see there's somebody who does have their hand up. Let me.
Hi guys, looks like Claire's been kicked out, so I'll jump on and see that we've got Chris who's got a question. So I'm going to allow your mic, Chris, if you want to jump in and ask a question for Dmitry and Mike. I'll allow your camera as well, if that's all right. Do you want to unmute yourself, Chris, and you should be able to ask a question now. If you are trying to speak, Chris, you are still muted, so. Okie doke. Looks like Liz has got a question, so I'm going to allow her microphone and ask Liz to speak.
Hi, thank you. That was a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who's been involved in organising the event. So we've been working as a group of national parks to join the UN Race to Zero, and they've confirmed that the work that Small World Consulting has done to calculate the decarbonisation target for each national park meets their criteria. So if the national park makes a public pledge to work towards that decarbonisation target, that those national parks can join Race to Zero. And at the moment, we've got about half of the UK national parks have made that public pledge aligned with the Small World Consulting decarbonisation target. And what we'd really like to do is for all the national parks to move together to join Race to Zero and to commit to that. In your reports for each park, you do say that there is some flexibility in the kind of realistic achievability of the decarbonisation targets, not least because of the post-COVID emissions bounce. Could you just speak a little bit to that kind of flexibility? Because it could be that some national parks don't feel able to commit to the hard date that you've set, and they might want to kind of say in the region of or something like that.
Great, Liz. Thanks so much, and both of us, we're just really happy to hear that the Race to Zero have accepted our assessment for all the national parks. It's a major step forward, I think, for all of us. Yes, there is flexibility. I think we've always been clear that these pathways are sort of highest end, idealized, so to speak, trajectories. They start from 2019. That was our constraints with the data at the time of the inception of the program, and so we've been clear that the very steep reductions in the sort of coming years from 2019 will practically be impossible to achieve because of the COVID and sort of the kind of hiatus in emissions in the past sort of 2-3 years. So a short answer is that we are working with some of the landscapes, including Cumbria and lakes, to see how we have transitioned to sort of 2022 compared to these pathways. And we've been looking at sort of more realistic lagged pathways that kind of capture, the trend in the past 2-3 years, and then require a very steep ratcheting up in the ambition in the next 5-year, let's say, management cycle in the management plans in the landscape. So with those things, with those effects, there will be a lag indeed compared to the pathways I've just shown. But for most national parks, we are still in the net zero territory ahead of 2050 and sort of net negative emissions potentially in the last few years. So we can still deliver on our science-based commitments for at least the national parks and hopefully other parts of the UK with this approach.
I just wanted to chip in one other thought just on targets, which if you stand back from the whole sort of target setting process, and I think we find this with quite a few organizations we work with, that one way of looking at targets is that the danger is that the question about where you set your target, it just becomes a question of where are you shuffling your gap to? Are you shuffling do you want a delivery gap, or do you want an ambition gap, or are you going to have some blend of the two? And so I suppose what I'm really trying to say is that whatever the actual all these targets are saying, get moving and start taking action as quickly as you possibly can, because actually what the science is really telling us is that no amount of action is going to be quite enough, and we should all be doing whatever we can.
And there's quickly a very quick scientific term about overshooting the 1.5 degree limits, and I think there are different options now, but I think increasingly any year of delay is meaning that we are overshooting the 1.5 target and potentially triggering more dangerous impacts of climate change. So it will be harder kind of to bring the temperatures back to that level. So the quicker we go, the better.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've got a couple more questions with people with their hands up and also in the chat. So I'm going to ask Dan Lash if he'd like to ask his question now. We can't hear you, Dan.
Hi,
there you
can
are.
you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yeah, hi, Dan Lash, Exeter University. That's a great presentation, both. Thanks very much for that. I just have a couple of quick questions, if that's okay. The first is that the footprint, I could see a lot of it is calculated based on spend-based consumption type calculations. And I'm just wondering what nuance is in there, because we know that sometimes spending more money on things results in higher emissions. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of the nuance around what people are spending money on, like let's say it was a vegan meal compared to a meat-based meal, for example. And the second question I had was just around some of the assumptions on transport and visiting. And sometimes the trips people make to national parks are kind of complicated and part of wider journeys, especially if it's foreign visitors, they're combining it with visiting other places. And I'm just wondering what sorts of assumptions you make in the modelling about that. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll say a couple of words and I'll hand over to Dmitry for a little bit more, and then you'll find a ton more detail in the methodology at the back of the reports, I think. But I'm gonna refer back to what I said at the very beginning, which is that it's impossible to be accurate on all of this. And what I would say for all the work with the parks is that it's been a question of trying to work out what data is there and how can we best use all of that data. So there are a spend-based approach has got some real advantages in that it's system complete, but then we try and where we think we've got significant data are on how people might be living differently in the parks, in each park compared to the UK average, based on, again, data that might be available. We try and put increased nuance on that, but it's not, I won't claim it's a perfect process at all. And similarly with the travel, we're doing the best we can with the data that we've got. But specifically, we do take account of when we think people are traveling from overseas, and they're not just visiting the park, but they're doing other things as well. We do go in for a proportionate allocation exercise.
That's great. And just to add briefly, we have multiple data sets, and we try kind of to triangulate different parts of the footprint by comparing different data sets and to pick out those effects that you mentioned when higher overall spending means a disproportionately higher footprint from flying or driving. So we've got a lot of different data that feeds in and creates that kind of non-linear, so to speak, pattern that we think captures the current situation the best we can.
Yeah, I mean, but I think you asked specifically about data on diets and so on. If we had good quality data on the extent to which people have a vegan diet or plant-based diet in any of the parks compared to a UK average or something, then we could apply that. But I don't think we've at the moment got that kind of data.
Yeah, so average UK basket in there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Harry to come in, and then I think there's one in the chat, and then we may have to move on. If you want to ask a question, if you can, sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A, if you can put your questions in the Q&A. If we don't manage to get to them, all of them now, we have got a panel session at the end, and also we will try and respond afterwards to any that we don't get to. So please encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A. But Harry, I'm going to invite you to come, and then we'll move on to one on the chat. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike and Dmitry. Yeah, really interesting. Just a couple of points. The first is, I'm sure you're aware, but I just want to check. I'm sure you're aware that there's a Devon climate emergency with a detailed plan, and obviously it'd be great if the plans for Dartmoor and Exmoor, the Devon part of Exmoor, could tie in with that plan in Devon. There's a detailed action plan and lots of areas for for action, etc. Okay. The second point was that there's obviously a lot of emissions related to woodland and land use and peatland, etc. And there's a lot of decisions going on at the moment. Obviously, there's a very controversial discussion going on right as we speak about the management of one of the commons on Dartmoor. So it just really a plea to make sure that we tie in the plan with key decision-making points, because you can take a decision that can tie you into certain land use or certain decisions for years. And I think plotting those out and making sure that we factor these crucial actions in your plan to those decision-making points is thought about. Thank you.
And Mike and Dmitry, before you answer that one, the first question there actually links to one in the chat around how this reports works alongside those of the adjacent areas, which obviously have taken a different methodology and looking at different emissions factors. So if you could pick that one up as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so to answer the first question, I think I mentioned already this One Planet tool, which I'm not going to get into describing in too much detail now, but I'll just give you some background to it. So it's the sort of, I don't know, at least 5 years work of a guy called Puran Desai, who has set up this One Planet platform. And he's originally a neuroscientist. Things he's done that you might have heard of, he was kind of a leading light behind or instrumental in setting up BedZ, which was at its time a real leading sustainable housing development in London. He was he founded Bioregional, which is a leading environmental consultancy. He set up something like 40 low planet, One Planet living communities around the world. And but the point of his tool is he's saying, actually, the the decision-making tools that we routinely use are what he would describe as left brain decision-making, and we need right brain decision-making. And in other words, we need much better systemic decision-making tools that are better at looking at things, that are at joining the dots between different things. And so specifically, this tool, you can use it to take all the strategies from all the different departments within an organization and see how they fit together or otherwise. And you can link in different organizations to see how their work can fit together with each other's strategies. So specifically, you could use it for the parks to integrate their work with work that's going on in Devon, say, and see, where the areas for collaboration are, and indeed if there are any conflicts and so on. So it's kind of specifically developed for this kind of situation where there's so much joined up thinking required, and it's being used. South Downs are the furthest ahead with piloting it, and they are finding it really, really useful. So I would say, at the very least, take a look at that.
And a quick point on the second question, if I may. Land use change is a difficult topic across the country and globally, but we are in the middle of the climate and broader ecological crisis, and we have got to manage parts of our land, well, all of our land, but make decisions about certain parts differently to what has been happening in recent decades, and that includes restoring peats, putting more trees in, and managing agricultural land better. We know it's challenging. We've spoken to all parts of the country through this program and through other work that we do with local authority, private estates, and so on. And we have to find those compromises, but we have to have this bigger picture in mind. This is where we're heading, and we've got to be leaders globally as well. Amazon's got to look up to us and say, yeah, you have had some challenges over the years, decades in your land management, but you look at what you've done. So we can maybe do the same, avoid deforestation and stuff like that. So I'm going to leave it at this. But these are ambitious targets, but they are hugely important in our opinion.
There was one, I'll just read out them and maybe you could come back to them together. There's one about progress, how we would monitor progress, and are we going to do annual footprinting to do that? And there was one around the targets around land use change and habitat creation. Have they been informed by constraints and opportunities within the national parks? And how do they sit aside or inform nature recovery networks? Do you want to take those two? And then I think there's two others that we'll come back to. Oh, actually, there's one more that I think is related. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it quickly. Yes, to what extent has the study looked at habitat mosaics? So, the highest biodiversity is likely to be in a habitat mix rather than a single habitat.
Great. Sure. So let's step at a time. Monitoring. We are in discussions now with the family of national parks about developing kind of client dashboard, effectively. That's all the landscapes that the teams and their partners could use themselves with minimal support from Small Worlds to track progress across a broad range of areas that we've highlighted in our assessments. We are piloting this currently with one of the unitary local authorities in Cumbria, and we'll see how it works in the coming months with them. And I suppose it's the question of funding and sort of getting the right sort of product to you if funding is available, that you could benefit from going forward. And the last point on that line is that we're also talking to One Planet. We mentioned a couple of times Pura and Desai, because their kind of management sort of solution for organizations and broad partnerships, sort of ecosystems in your landscapes, looks very very valuable to us from the point of view how some of our results and potentially the ones that Dita's been talking about as well on the natural capital side, how it can plug in very effectively in you delivering this change at scale, fast enough. In terms of the what has been, there are a couple of questions I think on our land use change assessments part. If you don't mind, I'll kind of try to fuse them together. We have done what we call a kind of high-level opportunity mapping for land use change, which is based on the habitats and peat data in each landscape, and we used sort of the best available data sets at scale, so not going to kind of farm level, but covering the entire landscapes of tens of thousands of hectares, using in most cases remote sensing data products plus whatever ground truthing that is out there. And we have tried to find the right balance in restoring peat, planting trees outside peat, not certainly on peat soils, and managing agricultural land better. Now, this assessment has focused on carbon. It has aimed at be within the 1.5 degrees sort of share for a landscape, our understanding what a landscape can do. It hasn't looked into the in-depth into biodiversity impacts. If you have a kind of a pasture uphill and you put the trees in, we couldn't in this assessment, and we're not experts actually in tracking the change in the ecosystem and the species and things like that. So what we've been clear about is that we need to look into this holistically, but we need ambitious land use change program nonetheless, because otherwise we will not meet our obligations within the 1.5 degree world. And we disagree with Dieter, I think, on that this, in our opinion, is an emergency, and we've got to act fast on cutting emissions. Yes, cutting emissions, and we've got this bar stack on the top of the graph saying really fast, fossil fuels, agriculture, but we've got to be ambitious on sensible land use interventions. And we're clear that there are full benefits in many cases in our understanding. There will be a different mix of species, different mix of habitats. Yes, the mosaic habitats you mentioned, they would be somewhere in the data. They will not again, we're not going into farm level here in our assessment. We couldn't, but we have to be ambitious and be clear that we need kind of systemic change in a few areas where it's doable. And there are finally other assessments that we are aware of. I mean, DEFRA have done kind of multi capital, natural capital and economic sort of toolkit, for example, for landscapes that we are familiar with, and there will be other options out there. So again, it's just a continuation of the journey. I think there is other data out there that I agree would be useful to pull in and get those multi-indicators, in addition to cover. But again, we don't want to miss a bigger picture here. Back to the point, we don't want just to look at multiple dashboards and nice pictures without sort of remembering where it's all going and what we have to do rapidly, to mitigate the climate impacts and biodiversity loss impacts.
Yeah. Can I also chip in slightly as well? Because I think I just want to emphasize that on the carbon sequestration part of the carbon targets graphs that you saw, we do in the text, we do absolutely make it really clear this is it's not just about bunging up eucalyptus plantations it's absolutely about doing the right thing in the right place with a very keen eye on a wider environmental agenda. And when we just to Dieter's point, we had a company trying to look at how it could so-called offset its remaining carbon, and we looked at 65 of these certified projects that they could potentially buy into, and we found just five that we felt passed wider environmental tests. So really, really important to be totally on it on all that. I'm sure everyone on this call is onto that. Just on the kind of, you know, all the bringing together many metrics and so on. I like the intention behind it in some ways. And there's, you know, getting things right in a national park is incredibly complex. Just the land use dimension is incredibly complex, and then integrating that with all the other considerations just makes it absolutely mind-boggling. And amongst all of that, sometimes you get some very clear things that are straightforward and important, and they just absolutely come out at you, and you get to the point where actually we don't need to measure this any harder to know this. And so, for example, you know, there are some peat bogs that it's absolutely crystal clear they could do with sorting out, and there are some places where it's crystal clear that the right kind of changing, you know, the right kind of planting would be a good idea. And in some other elements of the footprint, for example, the food around the food that's in people's diets, you know, it is absolutely crystal clear that the very simple thing is the science is telling us from every angle we need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy in our diet, and that's kind of the elephant in the room that gets you know, it's so easy to, you know, we work with food businesses sometimes who will try everything under the sun to say, well, don't we need more analysis, when actually they don't need any more analysis at all. If you're a burger, you know, if you're in the business of making burgers, then there's really only one thing that matters, and you already know that without any more analysis. So I'm kind of thinking, you know, when it comes to complex analysis, sometimes there's a case for just getting moving, because what we really do need to see is action, you know, right now. So I sometimes feel a little bit reserved about having done this work for the parks with these long-term targets and trajectories and so on, and actually none of that means anything at all if we don't get moving right now.
Just on that point, just as a very quick final question, because I think it is an important one, particularly for the national parks and our farming communities. You touched on it at the There was a question earlier, which is about this whole point about, you know, the carbon footprint of livestock. And the question was, has an assessment been done of the balance between increasing carbon sequestration by reducing livestock on the moors and the loss of locally produced food, which necessitates more local consumption of food with more air miles and so on? And I know this is something that we, you know, had lots of discussions about as the work was being done. So perhaps if you could just briefly, if you don't mind, just address that one for the rest of the participants.
Yeah, okay. So when it comes to working out what the right thing to do with any piece of land is, you know, anywhere at all in the UK, say, there are always we have to try and find the right balance and the right optimization between different things, and they are you know, producing food, looking after biodiversity, dealing with climate, and we need to find a way of doing those three things whilst people can earn a livelihood, right? But let's just, for them, not because it's unimportant, but let's just keep the livelihood thing out of it for a second, because that's a whole wider question about how can we create the situation in which farmers are supported in doing the right thing. But for the moment in this conversation, let's just have a look at how we work out what the right thing is. And you know, what are some of the things that come out really clearly up? Because, you know, we talked to you know, people who are very committed to the idea of regenerative beef farming, let's say, and unless you believe in a world that's got no beef in it at all, then, which I don't think, you know, I don't think the science is clear-cut saying that that should happen, then you're talking about making good choices about where are the right places to be doing that beef production, and when you're doing it, what is the right way to do it in order to balance the trade-off between all those three competing things that I was talking about. And I think if you get into that conversation and you ask it with fresh eyes, one of the things you'll find is there will be some land that currently has cows on it, or currently is used for growing grass for cows, which actually you would put crops on it instead. Or you would rewild it, and because you would say, well, actually the nutritional benefit that we're getting from this isn't enough to justify, or you might do some trade between the two and just reduce the stocking density a lot or something. One of the things that's coming out pretty clear from the science is that feeding human digestible feed to animals puts a lot of pressure on the food system. So I don't know if that's a simple, it's very hard to be specific about a specific area, but there is a lot of open-mindedness required over the question of, what the choices are around what's the right thing to do with each piece of land. And there's definitely a lot of land in the UK that currently has cows on it and sheep, and needs to have either a lot less cows and sheep on it, or be used for a different purpose completely.
Thank you. I mean, yes, we could have a whole webinar, I think, on that very question, couldn't we? But thank you very much for addressing it there.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. That was super, super useful. We're going to have to join the Q&A from this item to a close. Just some housekeeping. I can see in the chat that there's a few people who can't get access to the Q&A function. Pop your questions in the chat, and we will all try and monitor them remotely and ensure that they're carried forward and considered for the panel discussion at the end. What I'm going to do is just quickly review the result of the polls which we've been having. And when I checked it earlier, mine's struggling to load now, classic. But when I checked it earlier, it looked like we had quite an optimistic bunch. So I think we were about an equal split between pretty positively towards kind of being carbon positive as national parks in 2050, and those that thought we would kind of be well on the way or at least carbon neutral. So classically, my screen has failed and I've got a blank screen, so I can't report on that. So we'll pick that up later. But on to our next speaker. So Hannah Jones from Farm Carbon Toolkit is going to be talking next, and our journey with Farm Carbon Toolkit began a year or so ago, and they've been helping us understand what carbon sequestration or emission looks like on our Dartmoor National Park land estate, on our forest and moorland holdings, and their work's been really instrumental in furthering our understanding of kind of the carbon processes that are happening in our natural environments that are unique to our national parks, and that's really helped us improve and further our understanding for our plan making going forward. So Hannah today is going to be talking about upland pastoral farms, how we can reduce emissions on farms, and then what opportunities there might be for sequestration in our national parks. So all being well, over to you, Hannah. Fingers crossed.
Hello everybody, thank you Alex, and thank you for inviting me today. Right, let's hope it all goes well. Okay, can you see my presentation, everybody? Alex?
Yeah, I can see it, and if you just want to click presentation mode, there we go. We are good to go, I think. Thank you.
Magic. Okay, so our remit was a little bit more narrow than Small World Consulting, and we have a real focus on the habitats and landscapes. So we're focusing on understanding the carbon performance of DNPA owned landscapes and the potential to help deliver net zero. So I led it from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, but it would be rude not to mention Alex's great coordination role and the essential input of Richard Knott on the ecological aspects of the work. So the Farm Carbon Toolkit was created by farmers for farmers over a decade ago. It started to focus on understanding greenhouse emissions from agriculture. So we provide tools and services to measure impact and projects to support farmers and landowners in real action on the ground. So just to sort of give you a background of the presentation today, so I'm going to go through the methods and results and the sort of findings and sort of concluding remarks, and I look forward to your comments on that one. But before I begin, it would be very much inappropriate not to mention the work as part of the Myers project, focusing on extensive peatland assessment across Exmoor and Dartmoor. Excellent data set. I'm sure it was used as part of the Small World Consulting work, looking at management and restoration of peat bogs. And just to highlight for the project that I'm going to discuss, the work does not include peatlands, as this is not within the scope of the land owned by the Dartmoor Park Authority. So it's just to ring fence of what we are focusing on for this work over the last year. So this is a screenshot of the Farm Carbon Calculator, which we use as a standard tool on farm, and it's just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. So In this plot, we've got emissions in the sort of turquoise teal colour, and on farm, these emissions are scope 1, 2 and 3. And then for that farmland, we can also look at offsets, which incorporate the woodlands, hedgerows, and which is particularly relevant today, changes in soil carbon. So particular management factors increases the carbon sequestration. So then we can have a carbon balance, which is the emissions, and you take away the offsets, and then we get our carbon balance. So that's a sort of idea of where we're coming from. And on Dartmoor and Exmoor, we work with a whole range of different farmers, and as central to their farm business, they have their holding land, they quite often have a new take, and then they also graze the common land. And if we look on the left-hand column, those farms have a whole range of landscape features relevant for biodiversity, of course. They are also integrated into the farm management and central to change in flux of carbon on a year basis. So within the holding land, that's very well mapped, and also on the new take. But when we look at the common land, there's very poor data about how much of a particular area there is, for example, the upland heath, and how much carbon is sequestered year on year on a heathland area or acid grassland that might well be transitioning to heathland area. So from the perspective of the farmers, the commoners, as well as the landowners, this area of the common land is really important, and it's a major area where the data resolution is relatively poor. So the objectives of our work with Alex and his team was to understand the carbon stocks and flows across its land assets, baseline the soil carbon stock, assess the current carbon footprint, and model management change across these particular land areas. And my remit for you today is to share about some of these experiences, so I can go through the details now. So major dominant factors as far as carbon sequestration in the habitats is linked to soil type and also management. So we incorporated those within the remit of our work. So the tools that we used integrated soil maps. So here's a map of the Holmore and Whitemoor, and in the orange area is the land that's owned by the Dartmoor Park Authority. And within this, we have a whole range of soil types, Moorgate, Hexworthy, Princetown, and Crowdy soil types. And there's a whole range of additional soil types on Dartmoor. So this was one of the sites that we picked to work on because of its heterogeneity. Now, soil type data, high resolution great data set came from Hogan in 1987. And this was available for Haytor and Holmore. In the absence of this very detailed data set, we also use a Cranfield soil data set. And the baseline carbon assessment across these was done on 12 land parcels of the Dartmoor Park Authority. And this incorporated a whole range of habitats, including woodlands as well. So for those of you who have background in this particular area, I've listed a range of different soil associations that we worked on. I've circled the ones that we have data sets for, and then there's a range of subsidiary soil series. And all this is very detailed. I wanted to highlight that the soil on Dartmoor is highly variable, and it is central to understanding how much carbon is stored within individual habitats. In addition, we looked at the whole range of different habitat types. So again, I've pulled up the sweep map, so developed by the South West Partnership for Environmental and Economic Prosperity, and integrates Sentinel-2 data combined with LiDAR data. So what we have is each pixel represents an individual type of habitat. So I've highlighted, for example, the bracken is in orange, and acid grassland in green, and the very dark green is broadleaf mixed and new woodland. So for each particular unit area of moorland, we've got the soil type and we've got the habitat, and then with all the data and management that's incorporated from the Dartmoor Park Authority, we have a range of management data sets, such as swaling, the controlled burning of particular areas of land. So the pilot study included 42 soil by habitat combinations, 126 soil samples, 630 augered hold and 126 soil pits. So it just gives you an idea of the scope of the study. But even within that, we have unreplicated data sets for individual soil by habitat combinations. And I would agree with the previous conversation, the presentation about the sort of resolution and the confidence within data sets. And so I would just like to highlight there's unknown variability around individual data points. And I very much hope that will continue in the near future. So each area that was sampled was greater than or equal to 1/4 of a hectare, 3 augered depths. So remember, we go down to 1/2 metre. And for those peatland data sets from the Myers project, they're obviously going much greater depth than that. So I'll talk about the confidence we have on particular soil types in a minute. 15 cores per location in their bolt. Carbon analysis was through loss of ignition. Everything was GPS logged, and we also took bolt density cores. So you need soil organic matter assessments to give % carbon, and then you know how much soil you've got from the bulk density, and the combination of those two will give you the total carbon yield per hectare, or an estimate of that carbon yield. And it's very much about knowing our landscape. So this was me investigating the gorse up on Horns and Dendles woodland. So whole range of habitat diversity, and we were ground proofing all those sweet data sets, and very useful tool, but there was also a level of uncertainty. On the left-hand column, we've got actual habitats. On the second column is similar habitats, and the third column gave you common misinterpretations from those satellite pixels and actually the actual habitat in the first column there. So for example, where we have data sets coming off sweep maps which stated eroded paths within we had acid grassland over degraded bogs. These were commonly eroded paths within acid grassland, so very different data set altogether. And you can quite often have sort of relatively low tufty upland acid grassland could actually come out as purple moor grass and rush pasture. So again, this comes back to that level of confidence. So all these sweep misinterpretations were corrected for the land areas that we were sampling upon. For woodland, there were two options for working out the carbon footprint. The best one was based on management plans from individual woodland compartments, which were done 2 years or even more frequently, and they integrated species, age and management. And in the absence of this very detailed forestry reporting, we used our farm carbon calculator model, which was focused on age and species within parcels. Both of these data sets were based on the Woodland Carbon Code developed by the Forestry Commission, which you can access online. And in addition, as far as management was concerned, we carried out Scope 3 emissions assessments, and these were incorporated contractors, volunteers, grazing for the ponies on Horns and Dendles, and vehicles and such like. So just moving swiftly on to the results across these different habitats. So simple report, first of all, is a Scope 3 emissions associated with management of those sites. We can allocate them to fuel, material, inventory, livestock, and then we got just under 7 tonnes of carbon per hectare, 7 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year associated with management, and then there's a 0.5 offset associated with recycling of plastic tree guards. So simple assessments there. But then we start moving on to the soil type and habitat, and I'll try and take you through this quite carefully so you can understand where I'm coming from. So on the y-axis, we've got mean soil organic matter content, and across the x-axis, we've got the whole range of soil types that we work with, and the different bars show the top in the first column, the top 0 to 10 centimetres of the soil assessment, 10 to 30 centimetres in the grey, and 30 to 50 in the smaller column for each soil type series. So with these soil series, I've broadly classified them, and the first point to highlight is soils over granite and the amorphous peat of crowdy soil type have the capacity to sequester a higher level of soil organic matter. And bearing in mind, and I'll come back to this in the future. So this data set incorporated all those different habitats I was talking about. So just keep that granite and amorphous peat has higher carbon just in the back of your mind for the moment. And then if we look at carbon yield, so this is total carbon held in those soil types. So this incorporates how dense those soils are again. And what you can see is a very similar data set. Over granite has a higher carbon yield, but it's really important to recognise that we're only going down to 0.5 metre. So in these very deep soil types, such as crowdy, that is an underestimate of how much carbon is being held within these soils. And they don't touch that deep peatland data set, which I briefly mentioned in the Mars project, and we are not augering deep enough to capture and understand how much carbon is held within these sort of amorphous peats, intermediate amorphous peat soil types. So then we look at the habitats. So we've got mean soil organic matter for the whole range of different habitats that we're working with, and further data sets are required, but early indications highlight acid grasslands have on average the lowest soil organic matter to a depth of 50 centimetres. And I'm going to focus on these particular habitats, these 4 circled in the red, because this is where the management on that moorland could potentially make some contributions to increasing the carbon sequestration. There's an influence on the annual flux in those particular habitats. These excluded sort of wetter areas affected by the hydrology, and they don't fall within the kind of regeneration management of peatlands that are covered in those sort of much deeper areas. So let's follow these ringed in the red square. So in better drained land, it's really important to think about the succession of what that landscape is trying to be. So if we start with the acid grassland, we commonly get encroachment of bracken, and/or that was followed by encroachment of gorse, and ultimately that landscape will sort of move into sort of oak woodland. But the controlled burning of landscape with swaling will sort of move the sort of gorsey scrubland back into acid grassland as a sort of cyclical succession in a kind of 10 sort of 12-year cycle. So if we so across the range of soil types in the heavy font at the top, we've got acid grassland, carbon yields through to bracken and gorse. And the first point to highlight, commonly you can see that acid grassland has a lower total storage compared to the gorse scrub sort of later on. So we've got a transition, we've got an idea of what the flux is from moving from a grassland to a gorse scrub area. Although I will highlight these individuals in the red that they are anomalies, or indeed we need greater level of data set to understand what's going on, because you can see that the bracken you would expect to be intermediate on that bank soil type between grassland and gorse, but it's actually lower. So again, I'm highlighting the need for more data in these particular areas. And just to give you a perspective on a number of Dartmoor farms the Farm Carbon Toolkit has worked with, we've got an average carbon yield of those managed grasslands within those holdings, about 254 tonnes of carbon. So you can see how it sort of fits in within these figures here. Okay, so let's look at the flux estimates. See the amount of carbon that changes year on year within a particular landscape. So how, in the broader context of how can management affect the carbon storage within these particular habitats? So flux between acid grassland and gorse scrub ranges across soil types between 20 to 86 tonnes of carbon below ground. Okay, if swaling takes place on a 10-year annual cycle, the flux varies between 2 and 8.6 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So if the landscape management changes, you would expect an additional 2 to potentially 8.6 tonnes of carbon to increase or be sequestered in that land over time, and this will depend on soil type. Or we can look at this question using a completely different data set. So on plaster down, we looked at unswaled land. So along the x-axis, you can see unswaled land all the way through to soil organic matter in recently swaled land in the right-hand column. Without going into too much detail, if we say it takes 8 years to move from the swaled to the unswaled, it's about 2.1 tonnes of carbon flux per hectare per year. If swaling is done in a 6-year cycle, the flux might well be a 2.9 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So why are we going into this? Because the change in management on a national park could actually make quite a considerable difference to the carbon sequestration and the offset of these emissions, which Small World Consulting detailed earlier, and we're improving our resolution of that data set. So in summary, for this particular part of the presentation, so estimates of flux for grass, potentially to bracken or to straight to gorse, you're expecting an increase in carbon between 2 and 8.6 tonnes per hectare per year, or for a completely different data set, we also fall within this same same range of values of about between 2.1 and 2.9 tonnes increase of carbon per hectare per year. Now, published data for lowland farms, when you're looking at agri-environment schemes, rough grassland to scrub is estimated at being about 0.05 tonnes of carbon per year. So what we're seeing is on that wetter soil on Dartmoor, where there's periods of anaerobic soil, it's waterlogged, the potential, even in non-peatland, or bogland, the carbon sequestration is much greater than would be expected if we're using lowland data sets. And again, this resolution needs to be increased by more data sets. So moving on to the woodland. We're using the data from the Woodland Carbon Code here, so I've just plotted this from their database. So just to illustrate the point that I'd like to go into, so on the y-axis, we can see accumulated biomass, and this is for oak, growth class 8, 2.5 centimetre spacing, no thinning. So the key point is that as the oak woodland increases to 200 years off, the accumulated biomass tails off and the woodland moves into sort of carbon storage function rather than a carbon sequestration function. Now, if we look at the flux of that individual woodland, it's the teenage years up to about 25, 30 years, where the carbon is really accumulating within that data set. So it's really the young trees that are really having a massive impact on that annual increase in carbon sequestration with our landscapes. So for the work I did with Alex and his team, really important to accurately monitor the growth rate of small trees, the spacing and management, and also adjust for projections associated with pest and disease risk. So for example, this picture was taken at the Horns and Dendel site. The aim is to get natural regeneration taking place within this very old and beautiful and biodiversity rich woodland here. These trees are huge carbon stores, but they're not sequestering a great deal. But in this area, in the bottom left hand corner, there's fencing of small, you can just see the white sapling just before it's in leaf, and it's these small trees actually doing the heavy lifting as far as carbon sequestration within woodland. And if we look at the compartment data that I was supplied with from the Dartmoor Park Authority to give you exactly an idea, so we've got different compartments. So in this 1.5 hectare compartment, we have is dominated 80% of broadleaf woodland that's 20 to 25 years old, and this is storing nearly 64 tonnes per hectare. And if we move into an area again with mixed woodland, 20 to 25 hectares, a much smaller area, we also get like 35 tonnes per hectare. But in a established mature woodland with closed canopy, that storage of carbon goes down to 1 tonne, an estimated 1 tonne per hectare. So we need to think about the established woodland, what regeneration is going to take place, and age is actually fundamental in actually getting some accuracy in this data set. So broad conclusions: soil type influences soil carbon, habitat type influences soil carbon, and habitat succession may provide opportunities for increased carbon storage, but there may be opportunities focusing on carbon capture on soil types over granite as opposed to mudstone. So we can really hone in on those efforts as far as carbon storage. Those soil types are really deep and good at storing that carbon just because of the hydrology and other environmental factors. So areas of particular management focus, when we're looking at succession from grass into bracken, is likely to increase carbon storage. But you know, so we start moving to the sort of controversial area. The grassland is central to the role the commons have as far as the sustainability and resilience of those agricultural holdings. So heathland, particularly young heath, has some grazing value, so, and obviously higher biodiversity value, and may well be better as far as preservation of archaeological sites, and it has better accessibility than gorse or bracken. So should management be much more finely tuned to hone in on improving heathland, which has a higher carbon footprint than grassland, but it also has the potential to deliver other essential functions of the commons. So to favour heath as opposed to gorse or bracken, management needs to change, need to look at mixed grazing. So a reduction in the number of sheep, an increase in the number of horses and cows, for example, moving to cutting bracken rather than burning it, and avoid swaling, because swaling, the burning, will actually favour gorse seed germination. But then we need to think, if we're having a mixed grazing carbon footprint, I mean, many of you may think, well, if you're including ruminants within there, that will increase the carbon footprint. So there is a real dichotomy, a sort of dialogue to be had in integrating all these multiple factors and functions and adding carbon storage within the mix as far as these landscapes are concerned. And then as far as in addition, there's a focus on assessments areas of woodland regeneration, and this is where the management and the focus of really careful annual monitoring needs to take place. And ground proofing is vital to gain accuracy in that very useful sweep data set. And bearing in mind this is a pilot study, replication is necessary is to improve confidence in data set and allow it to feed into sort of carbon footprinting tools, indeed to get it published. I'll just tie it there and just like to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Thank you, Alex, thank you, Richard, and thank you for my very resilient colleagues for sampling across some very tricky landscapes. And I've just listed my references there. Okay, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hannah. That was fantastic. I think we're, if you were coming in for a lazy ride, and I think you may be mistaken, going from the super strategic with Mike and Dmitry to the super detailed with Hannah. That's fantastic. And that's the nature of the challenge that we've got, haven't we, when addressing the climate crisis? How do we join up thinking between the two tracks, the strategic policy work, and then the people on the ground actually delivering the change? A poll is about to start, just in terms of if you would like to answer that, that'd be helpful, and we can go through the answers to that. If you do have Q&As, then put them in the Q&A or put them in chat and we'll try and pick them up. I've got a question for Hannah, just to get things going, which is, I think, probably the most important lesson for me when thinking about how we, deal with the climate crisis strategically in policy terms is, how important do you think we should be focusing as strategic organisations on soil types and planning for regeneration and habitat restoration specific to the soil types that we have in our areas, and do we need to be, improving our evidence on that?
The capacity for soils to store carbon is second only to the oceans. It's absolutely huge. And the below ground storage of carbon is higher than the capacity as far as the above ground carbon is concerned. And so I think, in thinking about total carbon storage, that's one factor. But if we have deeper, more porous, higher quality soils, we are delivering a whole range of other functions, supporting more resilient landscapes, and also factors such as water infiltration, water storage, which is obviously adds to the function of the sort of commons on there. But on the other hand, I would not say any factor is more important than others, but there are quick wins, and indeed some of the quick wins would indeed be focused on sort of woodland regeneration. And if there is an opportunity or in issues as far as resourcing, I would definitely focus on one particular soil type compared to the other. So I think it just adds to the sort of overall dialogue and sort of potential of these landscapes.
Awesome, thank you very much. I haven't got any questions coming up in the chat, so I'll just feed you with one more, I suppose, which is just reflecting on some of the summary comments you were making there on swaling in particular. That's a particular practice which is under scrutiny with the climate crisis. It's a mixed picture, isn't it? I don't know if you can go into kind of just discuss it in the round a little bit more in terms of what's the advice for people out there? Obviously, swelling is a in parts it's a necessary action that's needed to keep certain habitats that are supporting certain species at a particular successional stage, and we need kind of a nuanced understanding and use of swelling. But certainly, some of the data that you've pulled out for us suggests that with the right practice, then it needn't be so bad as it necessarily is accused of being in the press.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is sort of confidence and number of samples that we have. We did assessment pilot of the swelled land on Haytor and on Plaster Down. And in one data set, we had quite a dramatic drop in that surface soil organic matter. And in the other set, there was no drop at all. And, in many discussions with farmers, they talked about good swaling and well-managed swaling and not well-managed. So quite often knowledge transfer, experience, all those factors need to be included as those people sort of using them more. As always, I think it's working and collaborating with the commoners. What's the best practice, and how can we sort of open that dialogue to make sure every stakeholder has a contribution to that discussion.
Okay, we've got my helpful assistants or helpful colleagues have pointed in the direction of a question on the Q&A from Harry. So Harry asks, do figures for managed farmland take account of embedded carbon in inorganic inputs? I think that's probably a question in relation to your kind of Farm Carbon Toolkit approach as a whole.
So organic inputs, I would assume you are referring to manures and slurries. So manures and slurries are part of the livestock carbon footprint, the emissions associated with those livestock. So a lot of the breakdown of those manures and slurries are lost as nitrous gases and as methane. Additional organic matter that's added to the soil will be understood within that soil organic matter. In addition, if a farm is using a lot of slurries and manures in replacing inorganic nitrogen fertilizer inputs, that will reduce the emissions of that holding. So the impact of using organic inputs as opposed to bought in manufactured fertilizers will impact different parts of that sort of carbon footprint and improve the overall efficiency, but it's not like they will produce no emissions at all.
Cool. Thank you very much. There's another question in the Q&A from Harry Barton regarding, and I think I can catch this one, it's regarding engagement with Professor Richard Brazier at the University of Exeter and their work with the state of peatland on Dartmoor. So yes, we have, but not in our capacity with Farm Carbon Toolkit. So with our own Dartmoor National Park Authority holdings, which are quite limited on Dartmoor, we don't have a huge amount. We've got a very tiny amount of peatland in general. But we have engaged and used their work to feed into Mike and Dmitry's work at Exmoor World Consulting on this the strategic footprint for Dartmoor. And just whilst I'm on it as well, the interesting thing that's going on here is that the sweep habitat classification information for Dartmoor, because it's only available for Dartmoor, that Exeter University produced for us, we're using it both in the Small World Consulting report to inform that strategic footprint, and we're also using it. So Hannah's been testing it at the super small scale on our estate and seeing how well it can be ground truthed at those sorts of scales. So it's been interesting. I don't know, Hannah, actually it might be interesting for you to reflect on how you've experienced using that data set for Dartmoor. I know it hasn't been perfect and there's been some struggles. So
I would say it's been a learning journey. I would, to have increased confidence, it does need to be ground proofed, but just the data for bracken, I think, would need to be less assessed. We can be quite confident on bracken data, but where we have gorse and heath mixed together, a much greater depth of detail needs to be had for those particular habitats. So Yeah, and flushes, fens, marshes and swamps were relatively poorly represented on that sweep data set, as opposed to acid grassland, which was quite reliable. So difference between different habitats.
Okay, cool. That's really useful. Thank you very much. So I just reflect on the poll. I can now actually see the results for the first poll. It's decided to load now. So 37% were saying that in 2050 the national parks are substantially carbon positive, helping mitigate emissions in the UK's urban areas. So we have got a group of positive thinkers, which is nice to see. In 2050, 34% said in 2050 the national parks carbon neutral, 26% said we're well on the way, but not yet. And then only 3% saying we've made a little progress. So that's actually really positive to see. And then in a while we'll close the poll we'll close the current poll and reflect on the answers to that. If I could, I'd like to hand over to Claire, who should be introducing our next speaker, which is Dieter Helm.
Thanks very much. Yes, we're going to do another big shift in focus now for our next speaker. So I'm delighted to welcome Sir Dieter Helm. Hopefully, Dieter, you're there and we can get your camera and a microphone switched on. So Dieter is Professor of Economic Policy at Oxford University. He was chair of the Natural Capital Committee until it finished in 2020, and is also author of several books on natural capital, energy and climate, including Net Zero, How Do We Stop Causing Climate Change? So Dieter's going to talk to us now, and his sort of theme is around what can we really do about the climate emergency in our national parks. So Dieter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me along. I can't say other than I like the background you've got behind you with I hope Exmoor ponies there in doing the grazing. I'm assuming you can hear me all clearly.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So what I thought I would do was to stand back from the detail of, soil carbon and so on, and talk about national parks in the context of net zero and climate change policy. I'm not sure I like the word emergency. If it was an emergency, and if climate change was the Trump policy card over everything else, it's pretty easy to think how the national parks would dramatically reduce their emissions and probably increase their sequestration a bit, which is that you just stop farming in the national parks and you'd stop tourists arriving and close the tourist industry down. And of course, that both of those are not what we want to do in national parks. And therefore, it always has to be borne in mind that net zero is a very important objective, but it's not the only objective. And it has to be managed in the context of achieving the other things that national parks are rightly charged with doing. And we also have to bear in mind that whatever policies are adopted, someone has to pay. And whether that be a carbon price, carbon tax, whether it be through indirect means and spending national park budgets on doing decarbonisation activities, or whether it be through the channeling of ELMS payments to farmers, there has to be some money for these things to happen. Someone has to pay, and ultimately all of us confront the challenge that we are collectively living well beyond our climate means. We're not paying for the pollution we're causing, and if we really did pay for the pollution we're causing, both in climate change and other ways, our standard of livings would take a significant knock. And we have to recognise there is no political appetite whatsoever to impose those costs on voters and consumers. And you can see that in the recent debate about dealing with the terrible situation in the water industry, where politicians reach for anything other than increasing customers' bills to pay more for water and sewage in order to clean up the mess. So it is important to come up with realistic approaches to policy and ways in which the national parks can make constructive steps forward, recognising that these have to match up with the context and reality that national parks find themselves in. And also bluntly, to bear in mind that climate change is going to be addressed in China and especially India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Latin America and the Middle East. And if we in our national parks improve our carbon footprint, which we should do, we are doing it not with the ambition that this is actually going to make much difference to climate change as a whole. That's a very sad reality, but the truth is that global warming is global, and local emissions and sequestrations are important, but important in context too. So nothing suggesting that we shouldn't do a lot about our emissions, but I'm trying at the beginning to make sure that we don't get carried away and, for example, cover national parks with eucalyptus trees or whatever would capture carbon as fast as possible, to the detriment, in some cases, of other objectives. So what we need to do is set net zero in the context of wanting to have sustainable national parks, and national parks which have sustainable economies, ones that can go on in a frame in which we face up to the pollution we're causing, or at least try to mitigate it, and pass on to future generations national parks in with their natural assets in as good a state as we inherited them. So to the positive, what could be done? Well, a lot more than's currently being done. The first thing that any national park has to do, and you know, today's event is partly discussing this, is to know what it's got. There needs to be a baseline of the natural capital of all and every national park, and that baseline has to include the emissions and the sequestration of carbon and the biodiversity and the water and the air quality and a host of other dimensions of the things that natural capital provides for us. And there's a lot of talk about, well, creeping baselines. You know, the current baseline isn't exactly wonderful. Don't we want to choose a baseline of where we ought to be? And then most people think somewhere in the 1920s or the 1850s or whatever. Well, the reality is that if we hold the line on our baselines and we make incremental improvements to it, we'll have done better than any generation has done since at least the Second World War. It's been going backwards, and backwards in some cases very slowly, in others very rapidly. And important parts of that are captured in what's happened in agriculture, but not just agriculture. I spend quite a lot of my time in a farmhouse at the bottom of the Punch Bowl in Exmoor, and there are pictures in the 1960s of British agricultural policy in action, i.e. the whole of the Punch Bowl ploughed. If you know that spot, you'll know just how difficult it is to do that, how thin the soils are, and how remarkably destructive that was. So if we want to be realistic, we have to set goals and targets which are achievable. And first of all, we have to have a baseline to know what we got and what we haven't got. And then we can start to move on to thinking about alternatives and what we're actually doing going forward. So when we look at a baseline, and if we do it digitally, and I'm in favour of putting up a baseline on a public website permanently and permanently updated for all and everyone to see, we have two wonderful options. The first is we can create hypotheses, scenarios, what I call counterfactuals, of different ways in which those assets could develop and be taken forward. So it's not simply a case of take a baseline, plant some trees and claim you've saved some carbon and then measure it, or you've changed a bit of agriculture and the carbon soil's gone up. It's much more about thinking about alternative ways the landscape, the land, the assets, the rivers, the streams, etc., could go going forward. For example, there are plenty of examples. So, for example, there are plenty of examples, but you'll see the point in a minute, of farmers who are approached by legions of people who try to flog them carbon offsets, or rather get the farmers to flog carbon offsets to them. Plant some trees, work out how many tons of carbon per tree, and then sell that to some energy company that has claimed it's going to be net zero and isn't in fact going to get its emissions down to zero, and so would rather pay it off by getting someone to do this for them. Well, if you're selling that offset, you want to sell as much carbon as possible, and trees are pretty easy to measure. That's why most of the net zero proposals for the landscape involve planting a lot of trees. Well, you can plant trees and have a result which is worse than if you hadn't planted the trees in carbon terms. People much more expert in these things than me, it's not really my forte, can tell you what happens if you take carbon-soaked grasslands, for example, and then plant them with conifers. And there are plenty of examples in Scotland and Wales where you can see what happens. Plant different sorts of trees, you won't get as much carbon so quickly, especially against the discount rate. But you might get a lot more biodiversity. You might create assets which are much more usable by humans and therefore yield lots of benefits in terms of access to natural capital, and so on and so forth. So you can simulate forward things that you could do to your national park. You can take any and each proposal that members of the public, experts and others come up with and transpose them onto your baseline and see what it looks like. And it turns out that the right baseline is not to take what we've got today and simply extrapolate it into the future. It is to recognize these are dynamic landscapes, and in some areas they might change very substantially. And of course, climate change will change them. And that's again why it's not simply a matter of extrapolating the baseline. So that's the first thing you can do. And to involve the public, to engage the local population in the developments of the parks, to participate properly, having such tools clearly and openly available, and for people to experiment with, is a good way of thinking through the options that are in front of you. The second thing that's great about having a baseline is we can then see whether or not capital maintenance is being carried out sufficient to maintain the assets intact. If you want a recent example to explain this, you know, water companies are running around saying, you know what, we want to invest 10 billion to sort out the sewage, and we want you to pay for it. It's investment. Well, most of it isn't investment, it's capital maintenance. It's keeping the assets intact through time, not adding new assets to the system. There's some of that as well, but that's not all what the 10 billion's about. And of course, if you don't measure the sewage that's coming out of your sewage works properly, or indeed how much pollution is in what's called treated sewage that's going into the rivers, you, of course, won't know what capital maintenance you should be doing. But being good stewards of the assets, making sure that we at least pass on to the next generation a set of assets at least as good as we inherited, means that we have to do the capital maintenance. And that has to come out of current spending, not investment and borrowing from the future. And when you start to look at the numbers that are involved in holding the line, as we might call it, it turns out that the funding of national parks is nowhere near adequate to that task. Now, there are other funding streams, ELMS, the money spent on flood defences and dealing with sewage and so on, natural capital methods of doing that. There are proper offsets as opposed to the greenwash that's going on a massive scale, as far as I can see, in respect of particularly tree planting. Some tree planting is good, but right place, right occasions, and a whole host of other possibilities. I'm in favour of a tourist tax, for example, at least voluntary to start with, but then compulsory for people who come into the national park and enjoy its natural or their natural assets as we go forward. So we need a baseline. We need to digitalise that. That's what the technologies now enable us to do. We need to put those on websites for each of the national parks. We need to give that access to the citizens, particularly the inhabitants of the national park, but people interested from outside. We have to enable anyone and everyone to simulate how this could go forward. And we have to be very careful that we're measuring in real time, all the time, whether in fact we're maintaining the assets intact. And that's all about capital maintenance. Now, all of that's before we get to the specific focus on carbon. And one of the great delusions about climate change discussions until recently, apart from the one that we're making progress, failing to recognise that we've been adding 2 parts per million to the carbon in the atmosphere every year for the last 33 years. And it's the stock of carbon in the atmosphere that matters. That's what the greenhouse effect is all about. So apart from failing to recognise that we're not making much progress yet, the other failure is to concentrate almost exclusively for the last 30 years on emissions and forget about sequestration. The stock of carbon in the atmosphere we have is net of the emissions we put up and the sequestration the natural world takes back out again. And those are the two dimensions that need to be taken into account. And we need to focus on both. So on the emissions side, in national parks, as the study by Small World rightly focuses on, the big emissions are to do with the way the national park is used, and the two big emitters are the tourists who come to the park and the farmers and the land use. That's not to blame anybody, that's simply to say those are the two big ticket items that need to be looked at. So on tourists coming to the parks, if you look at most parks, the chances of this not being by car in large measure for the next decade or more, the chances are extremely low. And indeed, were those cars to be electric cars, why would we be so worried? What we're worried about is fossil fuel emissions from petrol and diesel cars. And of course, we have lots of those because we have virtually no charging networks of substance within any of the national parks in the UK. By the way, just an aside, don't get carried away with the idea that because people go around talking about electric cars being zero emissions, that they are. Behind an electric car lies cobalt, nickel, lithium, and copper. Cobalt from things like the enormous mines with their child labour in the middle of the Congo rainforests. Nickel from refineries, particularly in Russia, spilling into the Arctic, and of course massive mining pollution in China, and indeed also in Chile. All of that goes into your battery for your car. And then there's the manufacture of the batteries, which is a carbon intensive activity. Of course, the solar panels are almost entirely made in China. They are incredibly energy intensive to produce, mainly from coal. And of course, slave Uyghur labor is used to produce quite a lot of those panels. So I could go on through the complete supply chain, but when I drive around in my electric car and feel virtuous, you have to put a smidgen of reality behind that. There are no net zero cars. It's just a question of relative pollution. But if we want to deal with the emissions caused in national parks by attracting people to them, Well, we need to start with the cars. We also probably need to look at the heating and energy used by all the hotels, pubs, restaurants, leisure facilities, the import of the drink and the food and all that kind of stuff. And that's a big, big bit. As regards the agriculture, well, climate scientists have pointed out what the carbon characteristics of sheep are, and particularly sheep in significant numbers. And recent disputes about trying to reduce sheep densities illustrate the trade-offs between different dimensions, aspects, ambitions and objectives of the national parks. But that's where one would start. Where one wouldn't start is saying, oh, well, we can offset our emissions by just planting lots of trees. Tree planting is a good idea. Right trees in the right place, multiple potential benefits, particularly natural capital flood management, lots of impacts on temperature in rivers, lining riverbanks with appropriate trees, and of course lots of biodiversity benefits if they happen to be things like oaks, but very few if they're thicker spruce, or the example which I always throw in just to illustrate the point, fast-growing eucalyptus trees, which I'm told are the best way to sequestrate carbon at speed. Nobody in their right minds would want to plant those, but it illustrates my point that tree planting is part of a wider natural capital ambition rather than a narrow carbon one, although it has some carbon benefits depending what was underneath it before. So, for example, if you know Exmoor, the planting of trees on By Common has lots and lots of attractive features, although there's a lot of carbon intensive infrastructure to keep the deers out, deal with the squirrels, worry about the disease, worry about the fires and all those kind of things that go with it. So it's complicated, and it will require a lot of capital maintenance going forward to ensure that the trees actually deliver what they're promised to do, particularly if a carbon offset's been sold. Because if you look at most carbon offsets, 25 years to get your carbon? Well, that's a long time in which lots of things can possibly go wrong. And forestry is a profession, a trade, an activity, and forests need management. And then there's, of course, if you're going to plant this woodland, what happens at the end of life? So on Saturday, I was driving if you know Exmoor, along Ash Lane, down the hill into Withypool, and there's been a fabulous bit of hedge laying being done at the top of the hill along the road that goes over towards over the top of Winsford Hill towards Dulverton. And right next to it, and I photographed it, are some fantastic bonfires, because all that timber that's been taken out of the hedges to lay them properly is now being burnt. Well, that's not permanently sequestered carbon to me. That's carbon that temporarily was in the hedge and is now back up in the sky. And lots of other PM 2.5s and other pollutants have gone with it as well. So you have to be very careful how those things are dealt with on the emissions side. And we have to worry a lot about the emissions from agriculture as well as from the tourist industry. On the sequestration side, well, the truth is that we think of farming as a sequestration activity. For most farming, it's net emitter, and we need to stop the emissions before we get through to sequestrating the carbon. You can see this on a global scale. Bits of the Amazon are now net emitters of carbon. That's an extraordinary fact that's emerged in the last few years. So changing agriculture, the first bit is to stop the damage before we move on to trying to sequestrate some more. And there probably is quite a limit to how much can be sequestrated in the national parks, probably because many of the soils are actually quite saturated in carbon because they're grasslands. Peat separate, it's virtually impossible to sequestrate more new carbon into peat, but we can stop the damage going forward. But of course, the one thing you don't want to plant on shallow peat in the national parks is trees, which are going to dry them out and allow the carbon to come further out of the peat offset a bit by the trees, which might be sucking it back up again. So where does this all leave us going forward? Well, first of all, it leaves us with the same set of problems and opportunities that national parks have always had. National parks have multiple objectives. They are the custodians of an enormous amount of multiple types of natural capital, of which one is associated with carbon and net zero. Some net zero policies help biodiversity and help with other natural capitals, particularly putting carbon back in the soil, but other types of net zero policy may do other things, and some of it may be detrimental to biodiversity, etc. There is no way out of having an integrated overall approach to natural capital, and it is wrong to think of carbon as a separate silo. It's very important. We should do a lot about it, but in the context of also meeting our other natural capital objectives. The opportunity that technologies give us is we now can know what's actually happening. We can now understand in real time, all the time, what's happening to the natural capital in each and every national park. That new opportunity means that national parks, like farmers, will increasingly have as part of their core labour digital expertise. In the larger farms cases, particularly in the east of England, maths graduates will be running farm offices going forward. Well, the parks need to digitalise, just like the recent report says that DEFRA needs to digitalise, and so does the Environment Agency. The idea that the Environment Agency is, it takes them 200 years to inspect each farm. Well, with using satellite data, it can do all 200, all the farms, not in 200 years, but in a day, if it uses the material that's now available. So we need to do that. But we need to do this in what I regard as a profoundly democratic way, which is we need to make these digital maps open to the public so the public can inspect, look, see, engage, debate the futures of the parks going forward. Massive opportunity. And that, I hope, will make the case for the national parks moving on from their current structures and from what the Glover report suggested to being proper land use managers of the land that the parks cover and which our generation is the custodian for future generations. Just think what you could do in a national park if the elm subsidies were part and parcel of the carbon of the national park budgets. If the carbon offsets came from the national park as the broker, not directly with landowners. If the flood defence benefits, planting trees in the upper waters of the Exe and the Barle, for example, and the Dart, managing those upstream parts of catchments, if the payments for that came via the parks, to make the case of how much more efficient, so how much lower the cost could be for any given environmental improvement, having those land use maps, setting them out, enabling everyone to engage is a crucial, necessary step. And that's a case which must be made, because what is so sad about the current situation is that farming is in a silo stuck somewhere in DEFRA. Carbon is increasingly a separate government department activity. Water and floods is to do with the Environment Agency and the water companies, and the parks are left as planning authorities with other things tagged on. This is an incredibly inefficient and wasteful way of using public resources, using scarce money, and getting a much, much better outcome in terms of natural capital and the well-being of our population. So that's what I'd urge people to think about, and that's what I'd urge people to do, not with carbon as a silo, but carbon net zero as an integral part of the overall natural capital management of the national parks within the context of making nature good for people, good for mental health, good for physical health, and good for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dita. That was very thought-provoking, and hopefully we'll get some people asking some questions as well. I think you've done a great sort of job of bringing us full circle in terms of thinking about the national park, the wider national park purposes, and where this sort of carbon agenda sits within that. We are going to run another poll for people just to respond to as we're gathering the questions and answers, and that's looking at what we think the greatest impact will be in terms of mitigating climate change in our national parks. So I wonder if you started off by talking about the policy framework, and I wonder just to sort of kick things off, you could say a bit more about whether you think the sort of current policy framework for managing our national parks is consistent with what we need to do around the response to the needing to mitigate and adapt, I suppose, to climate change, and where those you've highlighted, there's potentially there are some tensions between that, aren't there? So what would be the sort of areas that you think particularly there might be those changes needed to our policy frameworks to enable us to effectively respond to these challenges?
Well, the changes that are needed are multiple, and there are particular changes that are needed, but there's a much bigger contextual framework, and it goes back to the Glover report. I mean, what the Glover report sort of says, but what is true, is that the original idea of the national parks after the Second World War was heavily circumscribed by the politics of the day, and in particular the idea of preventing the national parks from having great powers to do interesting things. And that's why over time, when the budgets have been squeezed, and they've been squeezed until the pips not only squeak but till they've been crunched into the ground, and land them with essentially planning functions. I mean, it's true of local authorities too, although local authorities have now planning functions and social care, and that's what they do. The schools have been taken out of their control largely, the hospitals have gone, etc. So, rather than try to think of a way of just edging forward from this position, what I think is important is to paint a picture of what national parks could be, what I call the prize. So how much better could we all be off? How much better could our environment be? How much faster could we achieve these objectives like net zero if the parks were in the driving seat as opposed to being at the bottom of the peg? Now, one way of thinking about that, which I think is actually dangerous, but many people advocate, is to lop on to all sorts of public bodies, national parks, regulators, etc., the duty of net zero. And the trouble with that is, first of all, can you be sued for it? Right? Are you liable? And does it mean that when net zero comes into conflict, and I know people deny that there are conflicts, but there are conflicts with other objectives, that you have to pursue net zero? And the idea of a park and a park board is that it takes its various duties and produces judgments in the round about what ought to be done. That's why we have boards. The idea that we say, well, nowadays net zero trumps everything else, that I think is dangerous. So that's my concern. But within that frame and in the digital context I described, I think the first step is to show how much better off we could be if we integrated farm policy, water policy, biodiversity policy, tourist policy, net zero policy in a as I say, integrated framework within the parks, and show how much more we could achieve at no additional cost.
Thank you. Yes, and certainly that was part of the discussions that came out of the Glover review in terms of whether national parks should have extra statutory responsibilities in terms of climate. I've seen a comment from Harry Barton from Devon Wildlife Trust, who said that the short answer is that it's complicated, but ultimately it's about priorities, and we need perhaps an open discussion as what the top priorities are in national parks, and certainly, you know, we see very much the processes in terms of developing our partnership plans, and on Exmoor we're in that process at the moment as being part of that discussion. So I know that Alex has got a question. I'll just see if there are any. I don't see any other hands up, but if anyone else does have a question for Dita, please either put your hand up or put it in the Q&A. Alex.
Thanks, Claire. It's just to just note a comment in the Q&A from Liz, who said from the newly anointed Banal Bracheniog, I hope I've pronounced that right, National Park. They use donut economics to assess the environmental and social baseline in relation to all 9 planetary boundaries and Sustainable Development Goals. And she's provided a link, and that she's, you know, said that they're going to monitor it into the future. That's really useful. Thank you for that, Liz. It's just an interesting reflection for me. I've read Kate Rath's book, Donut Economics, and I think it's really useful. But it'd be really useful, Dita, if you could comment on how appropriate you think those planetary boundaries are for national parks and local authorities to be applying as part of the natural capital framework you've described in your presentation.
Okay, well, I'll disappoint you to start with, which is I don't rate donut economics. I think economics is perfectly straightforward as it is. It's a servant and a tool, and it's about how to allocate scarce resources. A separate issue is an issue about what a sustainable national park would look like. And to me, and I say this having sent off this morning my book on the sustainable economy to the publishers, to me, it's a national park which is capable of bequeathing to the next generation a set of assets, not services, assets, so that future people, including the people living in a national park, can choose how to live their lives and have the capability to do that, which nature provides for them. Okay. Now, that's a fairly clear and well-defined concept, and that requires us to internalize pollution. So that means essentially polluters paying. Remember, in our national parks, most farmers expect to be paid not to pollute. So you have to be very careful of how this works in practice, but it's quite radical. It requires us to take a precautionary approach. So be very careful before we upset the apple cart and its various component parts. And it requires us to maintain those assets at least as good as they are through time. And I think that's pretty well from. Now, if you say planetary boundaries, of course, it's right that the human population of 8 billion, compared with the 2 billion that existed 120 years ago, will have to live within the capacity of the planet to sustain them, because otherwise they won't. And the way we live at the moment is clearly unsustainable, and therefore it follows automatically it will not be sustained. And the next book I'm going to write is called How It Ends, because we're not sustaining what we're doing, and there's no evidence whatsoever we're about to do that anytime soon. So we have to have that context going forward. And then the question is, well, should, for example, Exmoor take account of the world balance of food, or the world balance of fresh water, or indeed the world balance of carbon? And the answer is that Exmoor will make no difference to any of those things, whatever Exmoor does. We would like it was different, but the fact is it's not going to make any difference. The right approach is the other way around, which is, should we responsibly make sure that we're not making any of those problems worse? And should we reduce the environmental footprint within Exmoor or Dartmoor or the other national parks? To which the answer is so obviously yes. Okay? And you can think of lots of ways in which that can be done. And of course, you would like the citizens and the tourists to behave in a responsible and sustainable way too. But before you rush around and get everyone to rip out their log burning stoves, you do have to think about the practicalities of what heating systems you're actually going to provide, etc., etc. So I think it's a perfectly pragmatic way forward here. You don't need to get yourself hooked on planetary boundaries and donuts and ice cream or whatever the other economy is that people want to describe. It's a perfectly straightforward world of costs, benefits, and environmentally sustainable and non-sustainable concepts to draw upon.
I see that Liz from Buy Now Friend Nidiog is got her hands up, so she might want to just come back in on that. Do you, Liz?
You'd expect me to, yes. I mean, I don't think many people would agree with you, actually, Dieter, that we've got a perfectly sort of simple economic system of cost benefits. I don't think it is working for the planet or for the majority of people on that planet, let alone nature. And I think there is value in having a different look at economics and what sort of society do we want, what do we measure and what do we value. The point of planetary boundaries and the 9 that have been identified by the Stockholm Resilience Institute is to precisely do what you're talking about, look at the environmental limits in the round and not just pull out climate or one or other thing. It's about having an integrated approach. And the point about donut economics is to kind of balance that with human needs and making sure that we're really addressing the sustainable development goals that all of humanity came together and agreed those are the important things that we need to work towards. And putting those two things together. And the practical reason that we have decided to use this as a model in the National Park at Banaibacheniog is because we wanted some methodology that helped us to look at not just the trade-offs, but also the win-wins. And I think I've found a lot of what you said really interesting, but also quite negative. I think there are a lot more positives in the situation than you're drawing out, because there are lots of things that we would want to do to tackle climate change and reverse nature decline that are also going to be really good for our local economies and the well-being of people and our enjoyment and connection with nature. So I think that's the reason we've looked at it, and we're also really speaking to your look at kind of where data sits. We've tried to have an evidence-based analysis of what are the pressures on our national park from an environmental and social point of view. Like, let's really get to grips with the data on this. What does the evidence show? And then let's take the next step about identifying what should we do about it based on that serious analysis. So that's the approach that we've taken, and it's very much aligned to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, which pushes us to be looking at the well-being of people now and future generations, but also to be looking at how do we become globally responsible. So that's the exam question for us, and this is the methodology that we've used to address it. And I would say it's not as far as perhaps you have painted from what you were talking about, Dieter, in terms of the evidence-based analysis and also the holistic approach that we need to take.
So the remarkable thing is that there's virtually nothing you said I disagree with. I just don't need donuts to do it, right? So I agree that the conventional cost-benefit analysis is not the way to do this. You will need to look at assets, is what I stress, the state of the assets going forward, because you want next generation to have a set of capabilities to choose how to live their lives. Trying to make the next generation happy, which is what utility maximizing cost-benefit analysis economics does, is hopeless, right? Just like, I don't try and make my children happy. I want them to be happy, but I want to make sure that they've got a set of assets, including good education, to live their lives going forward. So I don't have any difficulty there. Systems, yes. They're not discrete bits. They all fit together. And absolutely, we're looking for win-wins. We're looking for things that both address climate change and biodiversity, and improve the water quality. And there's a hell of a lot of those, right? It's just that many people assert that all of them are mutually consistent with a first best net zero policy. And my view is no, they're not. Okay, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But when I look at the wild west of voluntary carbon offsets out there and what's going on with these multiple consultancies flogging these offsets without much regard to the future liability, to the maintenance of what's being put in place, let alone what's being put where. I mean, massive land purchases like in the Cairngorms. Of course, half it's going to be broadleaf trees. These are financial institutions, but the other half's going to be conifers. And that does timber, without considering where the end product goes of the timber and how the carbon sequestrated altogether. So I don't think we disagree about the substance and the detail of what needs to be done. And there's enormous scope And anytime one says anything negative about particular policies that are people pursuing in net zero, it's all you're being pessimistic, etc. Not at all. This is a huge challenge. We're not doing it very well yet. The opportunities to improve are enormous, and that should be done in an integrated way. But the reality is we're talking about resources that are scarce, and economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. The fact that much conventional economics does that badly is something I completely agree with you. I just don't want any donuts to solve it, right? I think it's a perfectly straightforward framework to do this. And I think a digital platform with using the new digital information and DEFRA coming into the 21st century, and perhaps even the Environment Agency as well, will be a fabulous way of bringing people in. And that's the final thing I'd say. You know, the thing about natural capital is for people. Right? Nature doesn't care a damn, right? And the moment you say, well, we want to protect nature without people, then I think you lose the plot and you lose the purpose of the national parks. So the national parks are great at taking people into account, bringing different diverse groups into the parks, sharing nature with them, improving the benefits to them. But if only the Highways Agency wouldn't take 6 months to put the stones back on tar steps, we could actually have a lot more engagement by the population in some of the most beautiful natural capital in the country in the middle of Exmoor.
Yes, quite. I won't respond to that one specifically. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A for you, Dieter, and then I think we're going to move on to the panel. So I'll just put these to you. So this is from Keith Howe, and he asks, can you elaborate on how in practice national park tourists can be taxed? He's thinking about how he can and does drive around Exmoor all day buying nothing and staying nowhere.
Yeah, I agree with you on the latter point. Okay, so many places in the world have struggled with how to handle tourists and how to get them to make some contribution. And, you know, I won't reinvent the wheel as to all the mechanisms that are available. But I'm quite in favour, in some dimensions, of asking people initially to voluntarily make a contribution before we think about how to take it forward. So I would say to people coming into the national park, you can become a member of the national park, just as the National Trust is very good at saying you can become a member of the the National Trust, you can become a member of the National Trust, and think what it is you offer those tourists and show them that's what you're doing for them, and ask them to make a very small contribution for which they would formally become a member of the national park in some organisation or form you think of. There's clearly tourist taxes of various forms. There is voluntary collection in every tourist location. There is just like people ask people to, you know, pay for an offset if they go on a plane. If you think of the many attractions, I'm amazed that nobody tries to collect money at tar steps. Nobody asked the ice cream seller whether he could have a box on the table to collect, just to get people into the idea of doing this. And then we start to raise serious revenue going forward. And I think it's perfectly plausible. I mean, there's absolutely nothing to lose by trying to bring to people's attention what we do for them and ask them to make a contribution. And, you know, it's amazing how many people do voluntary stuff, how many people contribute to all sorts of causes. Well, the national parks are a great cause to ask people to participate, but give them something in reply: membership.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think all national parks have some kind of, you know, donation scheme. So yes, it's making the most of that, isn't it? I have been reminded, a bit conscious of time, so I'm going to suggest if we could bring in Mike and Dmitry again. I think unfortunately Hannah's had to leave us, so to form the panel.
So thank you very much. I'm going to drop off at that stage, Claire. So
Dieter, are you able just to stay for a couple more minutes, just to cover quarter two? Yep, that would be perfect, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just so that we can put a few more questions to both of you. I mean, just to pick up one of the questions that's just been asked in the Q&A, it talks about national park authorities having a high degree of influence over development, but little influence over large-scale land use change. And so the sort of question is, how can we make more in terms of schemes such as the farming and protected landscapes funding to entice landowners to commit to a more holistic set of actions to enhance natural capital. And then the example is given around hedge laying and brush that I think you picked up on, Dieter. So Mike, would you like to start with that one, and then Dieter come back on that if you've got something to add?
Well, I think what I'd want to say is to pick up on a couple of Dieter's points, but also just to come back on the question of, can the parks make a big difference to what goes on in the world, or other parks? Is the contribution we make always going to be trivial? Well, in material terms, in terms of the number of tons, it's going to be relatively trivial. But I think what's the reason why Small World is excited about getting involved in the parks is that potentially you can be exemplary in what you show is possible. And one of the ways in which you can be exemplary is the way in which you show what an exemplary process looks like for dealing with the issues. And Dieter talked a bit about this as well, which I thought was really interesting and completely in line with where we're coming from, which is it's just such a joined up challenge. It's so multidisciplinary. As Dieter says, there's so much more to it than carbon, and the whole net zero narrative, I hope we've made this point clearly enough in our reports, but it's incredibly limited and can be really, really harmful. Actually, you've got to bring this together with where the parks can be really exemplary is looking at how you look at climate along with all the other natural considerations, along with all the economic and well-being and how people live considerations, all in one go, and how you do the joined up thinking between all the different stakeholder groups that are required to make this possible. So in that way, if any park could show how that process can be made to work, then my hope would be that model would be something that you could replicate on any scale you like. I hope that's an answer in some ways an answer to the question.
Let me, as my sort of final comment, sort of touch on that. So, and I probably didn't make this clear enough. Okay, so there are many examples where public bodies don't have the power to do something formally, but ought to. Okay, so it's pretty clear if you want to think about planning in any national park, you need a land use plan. And you formally don't, as I understand it, have the power to do land use planning. But just because you don't have the power in the sense of the duty and obligation to do it as part of the planning process doesn't mean you can't just do it. So if you take a digital map of Exmoor and it's your baseline and you do the baseline properly, okay, then you can, as I indicated, look at different ways in which that land use could change from what its current level is and work out which of those changes would have win-wins within them, which would have some significant benefits, say in net zero, but some drawbacks in other areas, etc. And you can engage your population in looking at those options. So somebody says, that somebody turns up without even thinking about the problem, in my view, properly, and arrives on the chains in Exmoor, says, you know what, you should rewild it. They turn up on Winsford Hill and they say, you should just abandon management of this and you should just rewild it. Okay, well, why don't we run a baseline with it all rewilded and then see what that land use would look like? Tell me where the heather would go. Tell me where all the species that rely on the management of that moorland would go. Tell me what you really think biodiversity would really look like if you let it all scrub over. But that's an option, so we can explore it. And once you do that, and it's up there for people to use, you go through a sort of osmotic process almost, in which people say, well, have you tried it up, seen what it showed like? Can we have a look at it on this map? Can we see what it looks like? And then people start to say, I'm proposing this development. I better just see what it looks like in this map, because actually, if it doesn't look very good in terms of land use planning, it's probably not going to be a good idea in the first place. And gradually we move, as we are for the whole of the United Kingdom. There's the Royal Society report from a month ago. There's another major House of Lords report. and the climate change thing requires us anyway. We're moving towards national land use planning. And that's why in the slipstream of that, by using this digital mapping, by hypothesizing different alternatives, you show why it would be a really good thing to do. And once the genie is out of the bottle, my guess is you'll end up with those powers, but not quite yet. But in the meantime, a lot of good can be done. So that's where I would leave that point. And I will drop off at that point, but thank you very much indeed. And I hope that's been helpful.
Thank you, Dieter, very much for your contributions. That's great. I'm going to hand over now to Alex just to sort of complete our polls before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So scores on the doors for the two kind of outstanding polls that we put to you guys. The first one was question: what changes are needed to enable farmers, commoners and land managers to step up actions to reduce carbon emissions and increase carbon sequestration? So the interesting thing that's come out here is that the number one response has been changes to payments under ELMS, and I think that's really interesting because if you've been kind of sitting close to the debate at the national level on ELMS, then you may have been aware of kind of this is one of the really important things that's been liaised to government, that common land, tenanted land and our uplands, you know, the options that are currently available under agri-environment haven't been sufficient, and there hasn't been a huge amount of confidence that the current options under ELMS are going to be a huge amount better. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that reflected in the poll. Second most popular response was financial incentives, and then close in third and fourth was, you know, good advice on low carbon farm systems, feeding into what Mike was just talking about there, but then also business advice and they're having to be economical. And then fifth, so called quite low down the priority list, is functioning carbon and blended finance markets, and then finally simplifying regulation. Obviously, they're all important, I suppose, but it's interesting to see how people are prioritizing things. And then the third poll: what do you think will have the greatest impact in mitigating climate change in our national parks? Number one, money, financial incentives, tax incentives, grants, subsidies. Infrastructure improvements, which is interesting, in number two, both national and local. And then if my estimations on how big these bars are right, I think we've got policy and legislative drivers in third. That's going to be sitting with us and national regulators. And then coming in the last, individual behaviour change, quite a low priority put on that. And then leadership, quite a low priority as well. So that's interesting. Thank you all for your participation in today's webinar. It's been really, really good. What I'm going to do now is just hand back to Sarah, who's going to do a final wrap up, and to see you all on your way.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Wow, what an afternoon. That's been amazing. Thank you, everybody. Thanks particularly to all our speakers, our presenters, Mike and Dmitry, who started us on this journey talking about creating a place that would be a joy to live in, work in, play in, and showed us some data which warned us against complacency. I think I was quite shocked at some of those stats about how our population's using more than the average, which perhaps you wouldn't expect. Hannah, thank you. Goodness me, the detail that we need to understand about soil and how it sequesters carbon in different situations according to habitat and wetness and what's growing there and what it's lying over, how the geology and so on affects carbon sequestration, and how we're only sort of scratching the surface, I suppose, literally, of our understanding on that. And Dieter, he's always challenging, isn't he? Yeah, it has to be integrated with what we're doing as national parks, wider national park purposes, and how we go forward integrating carbon into the work that we do. I agree, we do need better data on understanding the baselines, and Kevin over in Dartmoor and I have been trying to persuade people to help us with this for several years, and so I call out to Natural England people on the call today that this is something we really do need to work with DEFRA on and get a much better understanding of the baseline of our natural capital. So we're encouraged to be bold, and I take a few words from the report that came out at the beginning, Dmitry and Mike's report. The exciting and creative challenge for each protected landscape is to find a way to cut emissions in line with current science and be leaders in land stewardship and planning, while simultaneously creating better places for people to live, work and visit. So that's our challenge, Exmoor Challenge, Dartmoor Challenge, National Park Challenge. Hopefully today stimulated some thought and we can all work towards those goals. Just to say finally before I go, the recording it's all worked and it will be online. We'll sort the technology out and we'll send you links. So final thanks to the great team here sitting around, Dan, James, Claire and Alex, all the work you've done in putting this together. Thank you. Thank you for everybody who participated and asked such interesting and challenging questions. Enjoy the evening.